On the second morning of September 1887, a schoolmaster in Larkspur County sent 3 children home for the shape of their names on his roll book, and one of them belonged to Soon-ok Larkin, a Korean picture bride still learning the English word for enough. The schoolmaster held the only classroom for 40 miles, the backing of the county board, and the certainty that no one would cross him over 3 half-Korean children nobody had asked to be born. Everyone in town expected her to keep the children home, write no letters, and let the matter die quietly the way such matters always did. What her husband did instead, before the week was out, would leave that schoolhouse standing empty under a new owner's name. Soon-ok had not raised her voice in the schoolyard, though the schoolmaster, a narrow man named Elias Cobb, had raised his loud enough for the fence line to hear it, that he would not write foreign names into an American ledger, that the county paid him to teach children who belonged, not children who confused the register. The whole county assumed the matter ended there, that a foreign wife with no kin and no standing would take her children home and be grateful the door had opened for them at all in the first place. She walked instead to the Larkin Ranch at dusk, past cattle pens gone blue with evening, and found her husband Thomas standing at the porch rail already listening for her step, already knowing from her face what the day had cost. He did not ask her to repeat it. He asked only for the schoolmaster's name. Thomas Larkin was a man the county did not cross twice. He had buried a father the winter he turned 19, and a wife the winter after that, and what the county remembered of him now was the quiet at his table and the fence line he kept mended better than any other in the valley. He listened to his wife's account without moving, and when she finished, he set down his coffee with a care that frightened her more than any shout could have, because she had learned by then that his stillness was where his temper lived. He asked her only one question, whether she wanted the children back in that room, or whether she wanted the room itself to answer to someone new. She did not understand at first that he meant it as a choice between 2 different kinds of war. She chose the second war without knowing its size. Thomas Larkin rode out before first light the next morning, not toward the schoolhouse but toward the county seat, 40 miles of frozen wagon road, carrying a leather satchel of deed papers and a name written in his own careful hand beneath the county clerk's window. Soon-ok stood at the gate with her 2 youngest against her skirts and watched the dust settle behind him long after he had gone, understanding only that her husband did not fight battles in rooms where he could be watched, and that whatever answer he intended, it would arrive already finished, the way winter arrived on the plains, without asking the ground's permission first. The schoolhouse in Larkspur County had 1 room, 1 stove, and 1 register, and Elias Cobb had kept that register for 6 years the way another man might keep a Bible, as proof of an order he believed himself appointed to defend. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He did not raise a hand to any child. He simply believed, with the flat certainty of a man who had never been asked to doubt himself, that a name belonged to a place the way a fence belonged to a field, and that the names Minjun and Grace and little Daniel Larkin, written in his ledger beside a mother's maiden name he could not pronounce, did not belong to Larkspur County no matter how many years their father's cattle had grazed its grass. He had let them sit through the spring term out of a kind of tired mercy, the same mercy a man extends to a stray dog before deciding the barn is not, after all, its home. On the second morning of September, he called the 3 children to the front of the room, in front of 30 seated classmates, and told them the register had been reviewed by the county board, and their names required a paperwork the school could not provide. He did not say the truth plainly. He did not need to. Every child in that room, including his own daughter in the second row, understood exactly what paperwork meant, and Min Jun, who was 9 and had not cried in front of other children since he was 6, kept his face very still as he gathered his slate and his sister's hand and walked the length of the room past every desk, past every lowered eye, past the one boy, the Hargrove boy, who did not lower his. The walk to the door was 30 feet. It took the rest of Min Jun's childhood to forget it. Outside, the September air was already sharpening toward autumn, and the 3 children stood on the porch steps in the wide, indifferent light of a morning that did not care what had just happened inside, waiting for someone to come and tell them where a child went, when the only schoolroom for 40 miles had just told them they did not belong in it. Soon-ok arrived within the hour, having been sent for by a neighbor's boy who ran the whole distance without stopping, and she did not weep in front of the schoolhouse, though something in her chest folded down small and hard, the way cloth folds when it has been wet and wrung and will never quite lie flat again. She gathered her children without a word to Cobb, who watched her from the doorway with an expression that was almost, and only almost, apologetic. and she walked them home along the wagon road with her spine straight and her jaw set, already composing in her mind the account she would give her husband, already dreading the particular stillness she knew would come over his face when he heard it. Suno Kang had come to Larkspur County 3 years before as a picture bride, a photograph exchanged across an ocean, and a promise made by two people who had never heard each other's voices. She had stepped off the train at the depot in a wool coat sewn for a colder country than the one advertised in Thomas Larkin's letters, carrying a single trunk and a bundle wrapped in blue cloth that held, among the practical things, a ribbon that had belonged to her mother, the only piece of home small enough to survive the crossing. She remembered the first sight of him on the platform, a tall man in a dark coat, hat in his hands, not smiling, studying her the way a man studies a fence line before deciding whether it will hold. He had not been unkind. He had simply been careful, in the manner of a man who had already lost 2 people he loved and did not intend a third loss to catch him unprepared. The marriage that followed was not the romance the letters had promised, nor the misery the neighbors had predicted. It was, for the first 2 years, a kind of careful peace, 2 people learning each other's silences, 2 people discovering that kindness could be built the way a barn was built, plank by plank, without either party ever raising their voice to declare it love. The children had come quickly, Minjun first, then Grace, then Daniel, and with each child Suno-ke had watched something in her husband loosen that she suspected had been clenched since his first wife's grave was dug. He was gentler with his children than the county believed a man like him capable of being, and it was this gentleness, more than anything spoken between them, that had taught Suno-ke she had not married a hard man but a guarded one, and that the two were not the same thing at all, however much they resembled each other from the road. She thought of this now, walking her children home from the schoolhouse, because she understood that whatever guarded thing lived behind her husband's stillness was about to be tested in a way it had not been tested since the day he buried his first family, and she did not know, with any certainty, which side of him would answer. At the ranch house, Thomas listened to the account without interrupting, which was itself a kind of violence, because Suno-ke had learned that her husband's silences carried more weight than other men's shouting. When she finished, he asked to see the ribbon in Minjun's satchel, not because it mattered to the story, but because he needed, she understood later, a single object small enough to hold while the larger fact settled into him. He turned it over once in his weathered hands, the frayed silk from a country he had never seen, worn thin at the fold from 3 years of a boy tucking it into his pocket before school, the way another child might carry a rabbit's foot. Then he set it down with the same care he set down everything he did not trust himself to hold too long, and he asked Minjun, directly, whether Cobb had said the words in front of the other children, or pulled him aside first. It was a strange question to a 9-year-old still gathering himself, but Minjun answered it without hesitation. In front, all of them, even the Hargrove boy, and something moved behind Thomas Larkin's eyes that his wife had seen only once before, on the day 6 years earlier when a neighbor's dog had gotten into the calving pen. It was not rage exactly. It was closer to arithmetic, a man calculating, without any visible heat, exactly what a debt would cost to collect and deciding the price was acceptable. He stood, kissed the top of his daughter's head, and told his son that he had done nothing wrong by walking out of that room with his chin level, and that a man's name was worth defending, precisely because other men would try to tell him it was not. Sunok watched her husband's face and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that whatever came next would not be loud, and would not be quick, and would not, under any circumstance, be undone by an apology from Elias Cobb. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a ledger of his own, not the county's register, but his cattle accounts, the record of 11 years building a herd out of a bankrupt claim his father had left him, and Suno-ke watched him work by lamplight without asking what he calculated. She had learned early in their marriage not to interrupt him when his jaw was set that particular way, though this night she allowed herself, once, to sit across from him and ask if he intended to speak with Cobb directly. He told her no. He said a man like Cobb had built his whole authority on being unreachable, on hiding behind a county board that would always take his side over a rancher's foreign wife, and that speaking with him directly would accomplish nothing but the satisfaction of a shout neither of them could afford. What he intended instead, he said, was harder to explain and would take longer to become visible, and he asked her, in the gentlest voice she had heard him use since Daniel's birth, to trust him with something she could not yet see the shape of. She had never been asked to trust a man blindly before, Her own father had arranged her marriage with no more consultation than a farmer arranges the sale of a good mare, and there was something in being asked, rather than simply expected, that undid a small locked place in her chest she had not realized was still locked. She said yes. She did not know that yes would mean weeks of watching her husband ride out before dawn and return after dark, weeks of silence about where he had been, weeks of the county beginning to whisper that Thomas Larkin was selling off cattle for reasons nobody could account for, and that whatever he was building it the way he built everything, alone, in the dark, where no one could talk him out of it before it was finished. Word travels faster across open country than any man expects, and within a week the whole of Larkspur County had heard some version of what happened at the schoolhouse. Most of the versions kinder to Cobb than the truth deserved, because Cobb was a white man born in the county, and Soon OK was a foreign wife who had arrived by photograph, and the county's sympathies, unspoken but absolute, arranged themselves accordingly. At the mercantile, women who had once nodded politely to Soon OK in passing now found reasons to study the flour barrels when she entered, and the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Ida Pruitt who had once complimented Soonok's needlework at a church social, now spoke to her in the loud, overly simple English, reserved for the visibly foreign, though Soonok's English had improved considerably since that first winter, and she understood every word of what was not being said as clearly as what was. Thomas heard about it too, in the way a man always hears the things meant to wound his family, secondhand, at the feed store, from a rancher named Purdy, who repeated it with the particular relish of a man delivering bad news he does not entirely regret. Purdy told him, not unkindly but not gently either, that folks were saying Thomas had gotten what he'd bargained for, marrying a foreign woman sight unseen, and that a man ought to have known his children would pay the difference. Thomas did not raise his voice. He paid for his feed, thanked Purdy for the news as though it had been a weather report, and rode home with a stillness that his ranch hands, two brothers named Dale, had learned over the years to read the way sailors read a darkening sky. That evening he did not mention Purdy's words to Soon OK, but she saw the set of his shoulders when he came through the door and understood that the county's cruelty had reached him, and that he was carrying it the way he carried everything difficult, alone, folded small, tucked somewhere she was not permitted to see. She began, that week, to notice small things missing from the ranch, a portion of the herd gone from the north pasture, a wagon making trips to town that Thomas explained only as business, a stack of papers he kept in a locked drawer of his father's roll-top desk that he had never locked before. She did not ask. She had promised him trust, and a promise given to a guarded man, she was learning, meant living for a while inside a silence she could not translate. The children felt the counties turning more than their mother let herself show. Grace, who was 7 and had until that September counted 3 friends among the ranch girls nearby, found herself uninvited from a birthday gathering, with no explanation offered beyond a folded note in poor handwriting that said the party had grown too large for more guests, though Grace had seen the guest list herself pinned to the girls' kitchen door 2 days before, and her own name had been on it then. Daniel, who was only 5 and did not yet understand what had happened at the schoolhouse beyond the fact that his brother had come home early and quiet, asked his mother each morning when he could go back to school, and each morning Soon OK told him soon, a word she used the way a person uses a bandage on a wound too deep for bandages, because she did not know how to explain to a 5-year-old that soon depended on battles being fought in rooms he would never see. Minjun took the change hardest of all, though he showed it least. He had been, before September, a boy who spoke easily and laughed at his father's dry jokes, and rode his pony to the fence line most evenings to watch the sun go down over the Larkin land, as though the land itself belonged to him in some way beyond deed and law. After the schoolhouse, he grew quiet in a manner that worried his mother more than any tantrum could have, spending long hours at that same fence line in silence, and when she asked him once what he thought about out there, he told her, with a bluntness that startled her, that he was trying to decide whether Cobb was right, whether a name like his simply did not belong in a book like that, no matter what his father said about defending it. Soon OK did not have an answer ready. She sat beside her son on the fence rail as the light went copper and gold over the wheat, and she told him instead about her own grandmother, a woman who had survived a famine and a war and a crossing of her own long before ships carried people to America, and who had told Sunok once that a name was not a thing a book could grant or deny, only a thing a person could choose to carry with their spine straight. Min-jun listened without answering, but that night, for the first time in a week, he tucked the ribbon back into his pocket before bed instead of leaving it folded on the dresser, and Soon-ok understood that some repairs happened slowly, in the dark, without anyone announcing that they had begun. Thomas Larkin's business in town, which he had kept so carefully hidden, was in fact simpler and larger than anyone in Larkspur County suspected, and it had begun the very morning he rode out before dawn with his satchel of deed papers. The schoolhouse itself sat on land that had never belonged to the county outright, but had been leased, decades earlier, from a homestead claim the county board had assumed, incorrectly, was long since forfeited and absorbed into public record. Thomas had spent 3 days at the county seat, tracing the original claim through a clerk's dusty back room, a claim that had passed, through a chain of deaths and unpaid debts, to a distant cousin of his own late mother, who had never known she held it and was glad enough to sign it over for a price Thomas considered more than fair and the cousin considered a miracle. It took him 11 days of writing, waiting, and quiet negotiation to hold, in his own name, the ground beneath Elias Cobb's schoolhouse, the well that supplied its water, and the narrow lane that connected it to the county road. And Thomas did not announce any of it, because he understood, with the same patience he brought to breaking a green horse, that a thing revealed too early could be undone by men with more lawyers than he had, and a thing revealed at the right moment could not be undone by anyone. He sold off 40 head of cattle to cover the purchase and the back taxes the county had never bothered collecting, a sale that fed the very rumors circulating about his ruin, and he let those rumors run unchecked because a man who appeared to be failing invited less suspicion than a man who appeared to be maneuvering. Purdy at the feed store told anyone who would listen that Larkin was selling off his herd out of some kind of grief madness over his foreign wife's troubles, and Thomas, hearing this secondhand as he heard everything, said nothing to correct it, because the rumor was, in its own crude way, useful cover for a man 3 signatures away from owning the ground beneath his enemy's feet. It was the Dale brothers, Thomas's ranch hands, who came closest to guessing the shape of what their employer was building, though even they did not have the full picture until the final week. The older Dale, a broad, quiet man named Samuel who had worked the Larkin land since Thomas's father's time, noticed the deed papers left once, briefly, on the kitchen table before Thomas swept them into the locked drawer, and he noticed the name on the county seal, and he said nothing to his brother or to anyone else, because he had learned in 15 years of working for Thomas Larkin that the man's business was his own until he chose to make it otherwise. What Samuel did do, quietly and without being asked, was begin steering conversation away from the topic whenever it arose among the hired men at the feed store or the saloon, deflecting questions about the herd sale with vague answers about market prices, buying his employer time without ever being told that time was what was needed. It was a small loyalty, the kind that does not announce itself, but Thomas noticed it the way he noticed everything quiet and useful, and he made a private note to see Samuel's wages raised once the larger matter was settled, a note he would in fact keep. Meanwhile, Suno continued walking her children past the shuttered schoolhouse door each week on the way to church, unable to explain to Daniel why the building sat empty in the middle of a school term, watching Min-jun's jaw tighten each time they passed it, and she began, in those weeks, to understand something about her husband that she had suspected but never confirmed, that his love, when it moved like weather across the plains, visible from a great distance before it ever arrived, and utterly unstoppable once it did. She did not know yet what form it would take. She knew only that the air had changed, that something was gathering itself on the horizon of her husband's silence, and that when it broke, the whole county would feel it. The county board met on the 3rd Thursday of every month in a narrow room above the courthouse, and it was to this room that Thomas Larkin walked on the 3rd Thursday of October, 11 days after the final signature had been notarized, wearing his one good coat and carrying a leather satchel that Soon-ok had watched him pack that morning, without asking what it held. She had wanted to come. He had asked her to stay with the children instead, not because he thought her unable to bear whatever came, but because he wanted, this once, to walk into a room built to exclude his family and stand there entirely on his own authority, so that no one afterward could say the foreign wife had somehow orchestrated her husband's business. The board that evening consisted of 5 men, among them a banker, a mill owner, and Elias Cobb himself, who sat at the end of the table in his role as the county's senior schoolmaster, a position that granted him a vote on matters of education and, by extension, on the small annual lease payment the county remitted for use of the schoolhouse ground. a payment that had, for years, gone unquestioned because no one had ever thought to question who actually held the underlying claim. Thomas waded through the ordinary business of the evening, road repairs and a dispute over a grazing fence, with the patience of a man who had waited 11 days already and found one more hour no great trial, and when the chairman finally asked if any other business remained, Thomas stood, and the room, sensing something in the set of his shoulders, went quiet before he had said a single word. He laid the deed on the table, turned so the clerk could read it, and stated plainly that as of the previous week, he held clear title to the ground beneath the Larkspur schoolhouse, the well, and the connecting lane, and that the county's lease, which he had not renewed, expired at the close of the current term. Cobb's face, Thomas would tell Sunoke later, did the thing a man's face does when the ground genuinely moves beneath him, a small collapse around the eyes before the rest of the features catch up and try to rebuild composure too late to matter. The chairman, a banker named Whitfield who had no particular loyalty to Cobb beyond the ordinary courtesy men in small rooms extend to one another, asked the obvious question, what Thomas intended to do with a schoolhouse he now owned outright, whether he meant to shutter it entirely and leave the county's children with no room to learn in. Thomas had an answer ready, because he had spent 11 days constructing not just a purchase but a plan, and he laid it out with the same flat economy he used to describe a fence repair. The schoolhouse would remain a schoolhouse. It would remain open to every child in Larkspur County regardless of the shape of their name or the color of their mother's face, and it would be staffed, beginning the following term, by a teacher of Thomas's choosing rather than one appointed by a board that had proven itself willing to let a 9-year-old walk out of a room in front of his classmates over a technicality invented on the spot. If the county wished to continue using the building, they were welcome to lease it from him at a fair rate, on the condition that the enrollment policy be put in writing and posted at the door, naming explicitly every family in the county as entitled to send their children, in language no future schoolmaster could quietly reinterpret. Cobb, recovering some of his composure, objected that Thomas had no authority to dictate the county's educational standards merely by owning a parcel of dirt, and Thomas answered him directly for the first time that evening, his voice still level, still without heat, saying only that a man who could not tell the difference between educational standards and personal cruelty had no business setting either, and that he was welcome to seek a teaching post at whatever school the county managed to build on ground it actually owned. The room was silent long enough that the lamp's hiss became audible, and then Whitfield, who understood a losing position when he saw one laid out in a deed with a notary's seal, asked what terms Thomas proposed for the lease. What happened over the following 2 weeks moved with a speed that startled even Sunoke, who had grown used, over 11 days of silence, to thinking of her husband's plans as things that unfolded slowly and privately. The board accepted Thomas's lease terms within the same meeting, understanding that the alternative, building an entirely new schoolhouse on county land, at county expense, in the middle of a term, was neither practical nor politically survivable for men who wanted to be re-elected. Cobb's position, which had never technically been guaranteed beyond the county's goodwill, evaporated within the week, and word reached the Larkin Ranch by way of Samuel Dale that Cobb had already begun making inquiries about a schoolmaster's post, 2 counties over, in a town small enough that his name had not yet traveled ahead of him. Thomas felt no triumph in this, or none that he let himself show, because he had built the entire 11-day campaign not to humiliate one narrow man, but to make certain no future Cobb could do to another family what this one had done to his. He hired within days a young teacher named Miss Abigail Reyes, a woman recently arrived from a normal school out east, who had answered his advertisement specifically because it stated, in plain, unambiguous language, that the schoolhouse welcomed every child in the county without exception, a sentence she told him later she had never seen posted so directly at any school she had taught at before. Sunoke met her before the reopening and liked her immediately, recognizing in the younger woman's quiet directness something of her own grandmother's insistence that a person's worth was not a matter any register could adjudicate. The schoolhouse reopened on the first Monday of November, under new ownership, under a new teacher, under a handwritten notice nailed to the door in Thomas's own careful script naming every family in Larkspur County by household as entitled to send their children, and Min Jun stood at the base of the steps that morning for a long moment before climbing them, his sister's hand in his again, his ribbon in his pocket, looking up at a door that had once told him he did not belong, and now, in ink his father had written himself, told him the opposite. The county's reaction to the reopening was not uniform, and Sunoke had not expected it to be. Ida Pruitt at the Mercantile continued her careful, overly simple English for another month before some private reckoning of her own softened it, and Purdy at the feed store never fully stopped repeating his theory that Thomas Larkin had gone strange with grief, though he stopped repeating it within earshot of anyone who might carry it back to the ranch. What surprised Sunoke more than the holdouts were the neighbors who arrived, unannounced and a little sheepish, in the weeks after the reopening. Women who had turned toward the flour barrels a month earlier now standing at her door with a jar of preserves or an offer to mind the younger children during harvest, not quite apologizing in words, but apologizing in the language the county understood best, which was help freely given. She accepted these offers without commentary, understanding that pride was a poor investment when the alternative was isolation for her children, though she noticed, and never mentioned to Thomas, which families had come and which had not, filing the information away the way a person files away which fences hold weight and which do not. Grace was re-invited to the birthday gathering that had somehow grown too large a month before, and though Sunoke considered declining on her daughter's behalf out of a protective instinct that surprised her with its sharpness, Grace herself asked to go, and Sunoke let her, understanding that a 7-year-old's forgiveness moved on a different clock than her mother's. Daniel, who had never fully understood what the trouble was about, simply celebrated that school had reopened and that his brother no longer sat at the fence line in silence each evening, and it was Daniel's simple relief, more than any of the county's careful gestures, that told Sunoke the household itself was beginning, slowly, to breathe again. It was not until the first hard frost of that November, weeks after the schoolhouse had reopened, that Sunoke finally understood the fuller shape of what had driven her husband to move as swiftly and completely as he had, and the understanding came not from Thomas himself, but from Samuel Dale, who told her one evening while helping her carry water from the well that Thomas had once had a daughter of his own, a child from his first marriage who had died of a fever at the age of 6, 3 years before Sunoke had ever set foot on a train bound west. Samuel told the story carefully, in the manner of a man unsure whether he was betraying a confidence or finally closing a gap that needed closing, and what he described was a winter Thomas Larkin had never once mentioned in 3 years of marriage, a doctor who had refused to ride out to the ranch in a snowstorm for a child he considered beneath the trouble of a house call so far from town, a delay of perhaps 6 hours that Thomas had spent the rest of his life believing had cost his daughter her chance, and a funeral attended by exactly the kind of county sympathy that arrives easily once the harm is already done and costs nothing to extend. Sunoke sat with this knowledge for several days before she found the right evening to raise it with him, choosing a night when the children were asleep and the wind was loud enough against the windows to make the kitchen feel private in a way it rarely did. She did not ask him to explain himself. She simply told him she now understood, and asked only if it had been Minjun's face at the base of the schoolhouse steps that had decided him, or something further back than that, and Thomas was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, until he said, very low, that he had watched a doctor decide a child's worth once by the distance to her father's door, and he had promised himself, standing over a small grave in a spring that should have been warm and was not, that he would never again stand still while someone else decided what his children were owed. The revelation changed something in how Sunoke understood her marriage, though not in the direction the county might have predicted had they known. She had married a guarded man believing, in her early months on the ranch, that his guardedness was simply his nature, an inheritance of temperament, the way her own quiet patience had been an inheritance of her grandmother's survival. She understood now that the guardedness was a scar, laid down over a specific wound at a specific moment, and that every careful silence she had once mistaken for coldness had in fact been a kind of vigilance, a man standing watch over a gate he had once left unguarded, and had sworn never to leave unguarded again. She thought of the ribbon in Minjun's pocket, and of the way Thomas had turned it over so carefully in his hands the night of the schoolhouse, and understood that he had not been calculating a debt to collect from Cobb, or not only that. He had been recognizing, in the shape of his stepson's humiliation, an echo of the small grave he had stood over 3 years before Sunoke's train ever reached the depot, and he had moved to close that echo with the full weight of everything he had built since, because he could not have saved his daughter, but he could, this time, act before the harm became permanent rather than after. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, watching him differently, not less carefully, because a guarded man does not become an open one simply because his wife has glimpsed the wound beneath the guard, but with a tenderness that had not fully existed in their marriage before, a tenderness built not on romance in the way the picture bride letters had promised, but on something she suspected was sturdier, the particular intimacy of having been trusted with a grief a man had carried alone for 3 years. She did not tell the children what Samuel had told her. Some doors, she decided, opened only when their owner chose to open them, and she would let her husband choose his own time, if he ever chose one at all. Thomas did, eventually, choose a time, though it was smaller and quieter than Sunoke had expected, arriving on an ordinary evening in December with no ceremony attached to it at all. He took Min-jun out to the fence line where the boy had spent so many silent evenings in September, and Sunok watched from the kitchen window as father and stepson stood together at the rail in the fading light, Thomas's hand resting once, briefly, on the boy's shoulder in a gesture she had rarely seen him make even with his own children by blood. She did not hear what was said between them, and she never fully learned the details, though Min-jun came back to the house that evening changed in some small essential way, standing straighter, meeting his mother's eyes more directly than he had since September, and he told her only that his father had shown him something on the fence line, a place where a low mound of stone sat beneath a young cottonwood that Min-jun had walked past 100 times without ever asking what it marked. Sunok understood, without needing it confirmed, that Thomas had finally opened the door he had kept closed even to her for 3 years, and that he had chosen to open it first for the boy, because the boy was the one who most needed to understand that his own hurt had been recognized, rather than merely rescued from above by a father discharging some abstract duty. It was, she thought, the clearest evidence yet of what kind of man she had married. Not a man who loved loudly or often in words, but a man who loved by building, by moving mountains of paperwork and cattle and 11 quiet days, rather than saying the word itself, and by choosing, when the moment finally came, to hand his deepest grief, not to his wife first, but to the child who most needed to know he was not alone in having once been told, by people with power over him, that he did not belong somewhere he plainly did. Winter settled fully over Larkspur County in the weeks that followed, the kind of hard, bright cold that turned the wheat stubble silver each morning, and made the well rope stiff with frost by the time Sunoke drew water for breakfast, and the household found in that cold a rhythm that felt, for the first time since September, entirely undisturbed. Min-jun returned to the reopened schoolhouse each morning with Grace, and eventually Daniel too, once he was old enough, and Miss Reyes proved herself precisely the teacher Thomas had hoped for, patient with every child's differences and quick to correct, without cruelty, any student who tried to revive the kind of mockery Cobb's example had once made permissible. Sunok began, that winter, teaching the children a little of her own language in the evenings, no longer worried, as she had once quietly been, that a Korean word overheard by the wrong neighbor might become one more mark against the family, and Thomas sat in on these lessons more often than not, mangling the syllables with a patience that made his children laugh, in a way Sunok treasured precisely because his own children had so rarely seen him willing to be bad at something in front of them. It was a small thing, a man fumbling over the word for grandmother, but Sunoke understood it as another plank in the same barn he had been building since the day he married her. A marriage constructed not from declarations but from 1,000 such small willingnesses, offered without announcement, accumulating into something the county's cruelty had tried and failed to dismantle. She wrote a letter that winter to the aunt back in Korea who had first arranged the photograph exchange, a letter she rewrote 3 times before settling on a version modest enough not to boast and honest enough to convey what she actually felt, which was that she had been sent, sight unseen, to marry a stranger on the other side of the world, and had found instead a man who would spend 11 days and 40 head of cattle to make certain her children's names were never again a question a stranger could answer for them. The following spring brought a visit. Sunoke had not anticipated and could not have arranged if she had tried. The county board, meeting again in its narrow room above the courthouse, voted to formalize the enrollment language Thomas had insisted upon into the standing policy for every school the county would ever build or lease thereafter. A change proposed not by Thomas, who had never sought to extend his influence beyond his own schoolhouse, but by Whitfield the banker, who had apparently found the arrangement worked well enough, and drew few enough complaints from parents grateful simply to have a functioning school, that he saw no reason not to make it permanent policy rather than a single owner's peculiar condition. Sunoke heard the news from Miss Reyes, who delivered it with visible satisfaction, and she found herself standing in her own kitchen with the letter of notice in her hand, unexpectedly moved to tears over a piece of county bureaucracy in a way she would not have predicted 3 seasons earlier. It meant that whatever schoolhouse a family built or bought or leased in Larkspur County from that point forward, the language Thomas had nailed to one door in November would apply to all of them, a small permanent scar tissue grown over the wound Cobb had opened, protecting some future child neither Sunoke nor Thomas would ever meet from a morning like the one Minjun had endured. She told Thomas the news that evening at the fence line, the same rail where he had once shown Minjun the small stone marker beneath the cottonwood, and he received it with the same quiet economy he received most things, though she caught, in the corner of his mouth, something close to the smile he rarely allowed himself in daylight, and she understood that this, more than any deed or any lease, was the victory he had actually been working toward all along, not the humiliation of one narrow schoolmaster, but the quiet, permanent, unglamorous fact of a rule, now written down, where no future Cobb could pretend it had never existed. Elias Cobb did secure a teaching post 2 counties over, as Samuel Dale had predicted, in a town small enough and distant enough that his name arrived there unaccompanied by its history, and Sunoke heard, second-hand and much later, that he taught there without apparent incident for the remainder of his career, which she found she did not resent as fiercely as she might have expected to. She had asked Thomas once, that winter, whether he regretted not pursuing some further reckoning with the man, beyond costing him his position, and Thomas had told her, with the particular flatness he used for opinions he had turned over many times before speaking them aloud, that ruining Cobb further would have cost him nothing and given him less, and that the entire purpose of what he had built was to make certain the next family in Cobb's shoes had a door that opened, rather than to make certain one man suffered extravagantly for having closed it. It was, Sunoke thought, a very particular kind of justice her husband believed in, one built more on architecture than on vengeance, and she found over the following years that she had absorbed something of that philosophy herself, teaching her own children less to hate the Cobbs of the world than to build, wherever they eventually found themselves, doors of their own that opened wider than the ones they had been shown. Minjun grew into a boy and then a young man, who kept the ribbon long after it had frayed past any practical use, tucking it eventually into a small wooden box his father built him for his 12th birthday, alongside the deed to the schoolhouse itself, which Thomas transferred formally into his stepson's name the same year, a gesture that meant, in the plainest terms available to a rancher who did not traffic easily in plain terms, that the ground beneath the place that had once told the boy he did not belong, now belonged, entirely and permanently, to him. Years later, long after Daniel had grown tall enough to reach the top shelf of the mercantile without help, and Grace had begun walking out with a rancher's son from the valley's eastern edge, the county still told the story of the schoolmaster, who had turned away 3 children over their names, and the rancher who had bought the ground beneath his feet in answer, though the story had softened and simplified the way stories do with enough retelling, losing the particular grief that had driven it, and keeping only the satisfying shape of the reversal. Sunoke did not correct the simplified version when she heard it repeated at church socials or harvest gatherings, understanding that the county needed its legends tidy in a way real families rarely were, and she found a private amusement in overhearing her own life recounted back to her as folklore, embellished in places, wrong in small details, essentially true in the way that mattered. What the county's version never captured, because the county had never been permitted to see it, was the fence-line conversation between a father and a boy on a December evening, or the small stone marker beneath the cottonwood, or the particular tenderness with which a guarded man had finally opened a door he had kept locked even from his own wife for 3 years. Those things belonged to the family alone, folded away the way Sunoke's mother's ribbon had once been folded into a bundle of blue cloth and carried across an ocean, precious precisely because they were private, precisely because they had not been performed for anyone's benefit, but simply lived, in a kitchen, at a fence rail, in the particular quiet of a marriage that had begun as an arrangement between strangers and become, over the slow accumulation of 11 days and 3 years and 1 small stone marker, something neither of them had dared name aloud, but both of them had come, unmistakably, to depend on. On the anniversary of the schoolhouse reopening each November, long after the story had become something the county told rather than something it had witnessed, Sunoke walked the same road she had walked that first September morning with her 3 children trailing behind her. and she found the walk had transformed itself entirely. No longer a road toward humiliation, but simply a road toward the ordinary business of a school day. Children with satchels, a teacher ringing a bell, a building that belonged, in every sense that mattered, to a family that had once been told it did not belong at all. Thomas rarely walked the road with her on those mornings, preferring the fence line and the cattle he still tended with the same careful hands that had once turned over a frayed ribbon and calculated, without visible heat, exactly what a debt would cost to collect. But he was there each evening when she returned, waiting at the porch rail the way he had waited the evening she first brought him news of the schoolhouse, and she understood, walking toward him across the yard in the fading light, that some things about her husband had not changed and would never change. His stillness, his guardedness, the particular economy of a man who loved by building rather than declaring. What had changed, she thought, climbing the porch steps toward him, was simpler than any deed or lease, and harder to hold in a hand the way a ribbon could be held. It was the knowledge, settled now permanently between them, that whatever the county decided to believe about a foreign wife and her children, one man in Larkspur County had decided, on a September morning 11 days before he ever spoke a word of it aloud, that they belonged to him, and he to them, entirely, without condition, and had built the whole of his quiet, considerable life around making sure no one else's register would ever again be permitted to say otherwise.